Welcome back, everyone. Welcome back to Goku-san DBZ. Though, today I decided to choose an anime shirt I really haven't shown off before. My Yu Yu Hakusho. But anyways, with that said, this is going to be a special new collections video. This is looking at my collection of game controllers. So, with that said, I will not be showing though the Xbox One controller, only because it's currently in the box with the console. So with that said, let's look at a few of the interesting ones, shall we? First up, let's get some of the newer stuff out of the way, shall we? First up, that I'm using right now to control the music and stuff in the background, my, of course, Ps4 controller. Now, personally, this is probably my favorite incarnation or design overall. PlayStation controller-wise, I like the pad and everything, personally, and it feels really good. The grips are good, and I like the way the back triggers work as well. I think this is definitely probably the best. I'm not sure how I feel about the next generation design overall, personally. And next up, we'll look at my basic default favorite controller. For the most part, I play with my Switch. A little dusty, but this is my predominant, basic controller that I personally like using the most for my Switch. I just like the design, and it reminds me more of the 360 controller for the most part, which in my opinion is in the top, probably 3 favorite controllers of all time. But with that said, definitely, I actually do think this is a great one, and of course, as you see, Breath of the Wild. Speaking of, my other one is also, of course, Legend of Zelda Surprise, and it is, of course, designed after the classic Gamecube controller, which I think is arguably probably Nintendo's best controller overall. I would say between it and the Super Nintendo are the best controller, personally. Next up, we have, get this out of the way, the Move controller. Of course, PlayStation Move, which is good to play for, of course, predominantly VR games specifically. Though there are games that are compatible, and yes, you can use this, I believe, with the PS3 as well, for some Move games, which is a good thing. This is arguably, of course, the new, this generation's version, replacement for light guns, since you have to have an old TV to be able to use the old light guns, unfortunately. Still, I think for what it is, it's actually pretty solid, and it works good, and I've never had any problems so far. This is arguably my favorite way to play fighting games on the PS4. Is arguably my Razer, well, as it says, fight pad. But yeah, this is actually pretty comfortable, and I like that it's designed more with the 6-button layout with R1, R2, as you see, basically more designed after the Sega Genesis and stuff overall, layout design, and that's a good thing in my opinion. It's a superb controller, and it feels really good for the most part. Last is a controller I got, of course, that to use for the Neo-Geo Classic color, or just the Classic. Sorry, wanted to cut that so it didn't take too much time, but here it is. This is the SNK style controller that you would have had you had the actual console, or like me, instead got the Classic. But overall, it's pretty comfortable for the most part. I think it actually feels genuinely pretty good on the hands overall, and I like the locations also of course, the select and start buttons, and it's too bad it doesn't have the clicky sound with the joystick, but still the joystick does feel good, and at least it's an 8-directional, so that's also positive. This is arguably also probably the best kind of controller to play a lot of your classic SNK fighting games with, And I think of classic style controllers. I think the Neo-Geo SNK Classic is definitely one of the best ways to play, and I'll worry about putting this back up later. Next up, let's quickly look at currently the only light gun in my collection, or as they call it, light phaser. You'll be seeing this in a later edition of pickups eventually. This is called the light phaser. This was specifically released for the Sega Master System. This is what you would play with a lot of your classic shooting games on it. Personally, I actually genuinely like the design and the feel. It has a nice click sound, which I actually appreciate. I like the overall layout and design better than a lot of the traditional light guns. I actually think the light phaser is really advanced. I think at least the feel and everything feels better than most other light guns of the 90s, though this was released in the mid-80s. Still, a great way to play if you want to play like classic old school shooting games, if you have an old CRTV, though that is. But let's look at the next batch of stuff. Next up, quickly look at my 4 and only fight sticks, unfortunately, that I have. Sadly, I only have, as of right now, 4 in my collection. First up, a bit one of the bigger ones. This is my fight stick that I use for my 360. Of course, Street Fighter 4, obviously. And personally, I actually think it's a pretty good, pretty well designed for the most part console fight stick. Personally, yeah, it's not the best, but it does pretty good for what it's for, which is for Street Fighter 4, Street Fighter Cross Tekken, and games like that is what I mostly use this for. Now, if you're wanting to go quickly, though, back in time to some classic stuff, we have this. Sadly, it's a bit smaller one, but this is my fight stick that I use for my Sega Saturn, which is the best way to play games if you're wanting to play certain 2D fighting games specifically. I like using this best for games like X-Men vs. Street Fighter, or Marvel Superheroes vs. Street Fighter, and obviously games of that nature. Specifically is what I prefer playing this for. I don't really use this for SNK just because I haven't really gotten used to playing SNK games with a fight stick. And this is arguably my oldest. Yeah, very small, not super impressive, I'm sure, but this is the fight stick that I use for any of my fighting games for the Super Nintendo. So yes, this is my Super Nintendo fight stick. And to me, this is the best way to play if you're going to play games like, of course, Street Fighter 2 Turbo, arguably. This is probably your best way to go about playing a game like that. As well as the classic Mortal Kombat games, the Street Fighter 2, this is the definitive way to play that game. Last, arguably the crowning jewel in my collection, which I have the complete box and everything, and certificate of authenticity. One of my personal things about this one, though, is the fact it has this in the back that actually you can store your cord in. That way it's not in the way or anything and worry about the cord getting damaged. That is, frankly, in my opinion, a very great idea. I wish actually more fight sticks would do stuff like that. But this is it. This is my big one, my Street Fighter 4 arcade stick. Love this thing. And yeah, this is even like Evo, like approved, which I've seen multiple people. In fact, Maximilian Dude actually has one of these himself. But arguably, love this thing, and this is easily the best way, I think, to actually play a lot of the classic Soul Calibur games, like Soul Calibur 2 HD, Soul Calibur 4. This is how I prefer playing games like that. I don't know why, Soul Calibur is like the only 3D fighting series that I actually like on fight stick, weirdly enough. But with that said, now we're gonna look at actual stuff. We'll go more starting at the newer and way too older. Now, I will not be showing the Wii U gamepad only because it is not. Now, here it is. This is how I keep everything stored pretty much. First up, we have a old PC controller. Now, surprisingly, this is actually will work with the PS3, weirdly enough, which is kind of bizarre. But yeah, this is what I had back years ago when I used to actually have a laptop and would play occasionally games like Fate Lost Chapters. This is what I used. Now, basically, it's modeled after PlayStation controller, obviously, with the sticks and everything, though it is kind of weird how the buttons are numbered 1, 2, 3, 4, which is kind of weird. Also, the interesting thing is how the cord works. You pull it out like this, and then you just press this back button here, and basically you put it right back into place. So that's actually good for good storage use, but it's a very interesting controller. I haven't really seen any others like this, weirdly enough. It's good. I like the grips. The rubber on the sides are actually really good for a real solid grip. That is good for like fighting games or RPGs. Now look at some more stuff. Technically not really a controller, but the original Xbox remote. Also, my one battery-powered wireless remote, which is what I've been using as of late for the PS3. I actually like this quite a bit, surprisingly. It is cool also how like the whole controller lights up as well. It's really a neat little thing. And I love how it's like all see-through. Always did like those kind of things. Then you have, of course, the classic original Dualshock 3 controller, which is really good. Up until the PS4, this was arguably my favorite. Of course, then we have stuff like pretty much probably my second favorite controller of all time, the Wii U Pro, which I absolutely just love the feel of this controller. It is genuinely amazing. Like I said, yeah, this is probably my second favorite of all time. Love the layout and everything about it. And just the feel. Also, on a bit cheaper end, another PS3 controller I have, off-brand. Strictly cord, but that is fine. It actually works surprisingly okay for like fighting games and stuff. It may not look great, but actually the D-pad isn't that bad. I'm not a big fan of the joystick, but I actually think the D-pad's okay. Then we have like original Xbox. This is my definitive favorite controller for the original Xbox. I just love the grip things here. This I have had, well, actually I've only had this one a couple years because the previous one I had of these sadly broke finally after having it for like 15 years. I was lucky to find another one of these online on eBay, thank goodness. Not expensive, but hard to find. Great controller. I specifically like the design of the bottom joystick. I think it feels really good. And it feels just right. The D-pad is 50-50. It's not great, but surprisingly it works just fine with games like Capcom Fine Evolution, believe it or not. The joysticks work perfect for games like Fable. Speaking of another cool one, I got back when I was really huge into getting Star Wars games on the original Xbox. This is a Darth Vader edition original Xbox controller, which when you would plug it in and turn it on, it would actually have lights inside turn on, and it would be the color red, like of course Vader's lightsaber. Then you have, of course, an attachment for the original Wii controller, and then a backup secondary controller. Which, to be fair, I like this one actually a little more. Then you have, of course, the Model 2 controller of the original Xbox, which I never owned the Duke controller, which is good because it had been way too large for me personally. But I've always actually enjoyed this controller overall personally, more than I think some people have. Then we have arguably, probably just about my favorite controller of all time. And of course that's the Xbox 360 controller. Just the feel of everything is like perfect. The D-pad is genuinely good, the buttons are great, the back buttons work excellent, and I think, of course, the joysticks is superb. Great if you want to play games like Team Fortress 2, or games like Half-Life 2 or Portal. And of course, arguably, the pride and joy, my Halo edition, green Xbox controller, which of course goes with my Halo edition original Xbox console. Which I love this thing, though I don't really use it. I try not to use these special ones, because I'd rather not wear it out. But with that, I'll quickly cut up while I put this all back in. Welcome back for the next part. Next up, we have stuff for N64, PS1, Dreamcast, PS2, and Gamecube. First up is my original, really old PS2 controller, which arguably I do love this thing, in all honesty. A lot of fun, always enjoyed it. Always thought it was a great version, honestly, though I still kind of like the original Dualshock Ps1 just a tad more. Then we go to arguably, like I said, pretty much my favorite Nintendo controller of all time, the classic original Gamecube controller, which unfortunately this is an off-brand controller. It's not an original Nintendo one because sadly I lost my original Gamecube controller quite a few years ago, so I had to just buy an off-brand one. But I'm hoping eventually to get like a certain special wireless one, but the prices on it has gone insane, so I may try to just find another wired one. Main brand though. Also, of course, we have the true original version of the classic PS1 controller, of course, which I know does look quite weird without the joysticks. I agree 100%. It's kind of weird after how many years used to having the add-ons. Then, of course, we have the original Dualshock Ps1 controller, which was quite a nice renovation, going from the original to adding the extra attachments plus rumble feature, which was nice as well. Now, personally, I only just recently picked actually up this because I actually have not had one for a while, so I was happy to find for a reasonable price range one of these Dualshock ones. Then we go to, in my opinion, one of the most bizarre controllers of all time, with the Nintendo 64 controller, which looks more like a boat, in my opinion, like you'd be racing with, in like a game like a Hydro Thunder is what it reminds me of, actually. But yeah, it's kind of weird and bizarre, I will say, controller-wise. Definitely with, given how this thing would sometimes really not work well after a lot of use. And given you have to use this for games like GoldenEye or games like Star Fox 64, I was never really a fan of the N64 controller, which is why I haven't gone out of my way to get more of them, though I do need to get one backup. Next we have also recently picked up a backup original Dreamcast controller. Now, unlike some people, I personally actually like the Dreamcast controller personally. I do think it's kind of weird though how the back, you would have to clip it into here in order for it to go out like a normal controller from the actual bottom. That was a weird oversight with some of the design, but one thing I did like about this was just the way that the L&R buttons felt. It just had a really nice feel and a good amount of power, needing to push it all the way down. That is good, for specific types of games would be playing with this, like Hydro Thunder, as well as many others, like also Check Run Radio. We have one that is sadly really yellowed over the years, and that is my off-brand Dreamcast Contour, though it would actually have a setup with 6 button controllers, which is interesting. Not a great D-pad, though. That's one thing I'll say. The D-pad and the joystick are not great with this, unfortunately. Then we have this, arguably, my personal favorite Dreamcast controller. The Black Sega Sports Edition, which of course went with the console Sega Sports Edition as well. But there's just something about this beautiful black design. Not a big fan of the Sega Sports logo, but still, it is beautiful in my opinion. And get ready to look at the last batch. And welcome back for the last batch. This is going to have, well, you'll see. First up, I can't believe actually how many controllers I have on these older ones, but that's because I want to make sure I had a lot of backups. So first up, we'll look at the oldest controller arguably in my collection. This is the controller for the Sega Master System, which is basically very much the same design overall as a controller like, well, I'm sure you know, very similar to that of the original NES, which I find is quite interesting. It's definitely different. I actually kind of like, though, this a little bit more than the regular D-pad of the original NES personally, though the buttons and stuff, still it's pretty much basically a copy, but still not bad for being a very early controller. And it's way better than most of the earlier ones at that. Then we have, of course, the classic, original, iconic Sega Genesis controller with, of course, the classic original D-pad start button and, of course, just the regular 3 buttons, which was fine for most games like platformers, shooters, and stuff like that, but horrible for fighting games, needless to say. Which then they would obviously decide to improve drastically later on with the 6-button design, which is perfect for fighting games, and I still consider this a defining controller, arguably the best controller of the 4th generation, personal opinion. Then we have, I have duplicates and a couple off-brands as well. We have, of course, the classic original Super Nintendo controller, which is truly iconic nowadays, obviously. Can't beat it. But then we have my personal favorite version, the Super Famicom version, with the multicolored buttons. I just overall just like the aesthetic and overall look, plus the regular Japanese logo and everything. I just much prefer this to the American version, plus with just 2 different shades of basically purple. There's like more, I feel, just more personality in this version, but to each their own. Then we have, arguably, the superb, great Model 2 Sega Saturn controller, which to me is the greatest retro, what would be considered retro or 90s era controllers. This is to me the best controller out of the entire 90s. Love it. I really like the D-pad, it feels great. Same thing for the buttons, even the top buttons have a real nice click sound that reminds me more of like the Neo-Geo, and I actually really appreciate that. Then we have, like, one backup, I have a off-brand controller also for the Saturn, which actually, I gotta admit, for an off-brand controller, this is actually quite nice, and I like the fact it has the ability where you can turn on and off like the turbo button, which is quite useful in specific games, that is, but definitely can come in handy. And for an off-brand controller, it is nice in the fact it actually has a switch on the back to deal with like speed, like how fast you want it to go, and I actually appreciate that, and a unique little feature. Then we have arguably the most unique, and this was basically the predecessor to the Dreamcast controller. Of course, that is the Sega Saturn 3D controller, which is very unique. Now, this game would pretty much be included with as a bundle with Nights in the Dreams, which is arguably, in my opinion, probably one of the most iconic and most fun platformers of the 90s. Personal opinion only. Keep in mind, and I'm admittedly a little biased for Saturn. One of the things, I love the Saturn logo, which you now see in the background there. But seriously, I do love this thing quite a bit. But it's getting very pricey nowadays to collect this, so unless you can find it for a good deal, maybe bundle with Nights in the Dreams, I don't really recommend trying to go after it unless you're a hardcore collector. Then we have the original Panasonic 3DO controller, which is really weird. Of course, you have a spot here at the top, which is where you would plug another controller. Yeah, I know, very bizarre and weird, is it not? And of course, 3-button like the original Genesis, which they would, through other companies, release an updated version modeled more after the second model controller, of course, which would be this. Now, this is quite a nice controller. I'll admittedly say I actually like this overall design. I'm not quite as big fan overall of the L and R buttons, but I do like all the extra options of like be able to program a lot of stuff on here is really nice, and admittedly the D-pad's actually not that bad. And this is a great controller to play games like, well, specifically games like Dragon's Lair is a good example. But for me, this is arguably one of my favorites. Now, I decided to save an interesting one for last, but you'll see that in just a sec. And actually, the last two controllers. Second to last, my original Rock Band controller that I got, or sorry, Guitar Hero controller, which I got with Rock Band or Guitar Hero 3, as well with the Aerosmith one as well. Great games, and definitely has a bit of like a nostalgia feel for me. This was for the PS2 though, but still, always loved this thing. Last but not least, I wanted to say, which I'm sure a lot of people have seen, and that is a TurboGrafx 16 controller, or just also known as the PC Engine in other countries. But this controller is very different than a lot of others of the time. Like you see, you can also set this to how hard you want it to do and things. And it's definitely a somewhat simplistic design overall, but I think aesthetically it's still quite nice, and I think it feels really good. Now keep in mind, this is the one I got with my Classic, because I don't have an original TurboGrafx, but luckily it is a perfect replica of the original Classic TurboGrafx or PC Engine controller. But with that said, that is it for my collection of controllers. And I'll see y'all next time. Same YouTube time, same YouTube channel. Hopefully enjoyed the turbo or retro wave music in the background. I'll see y'all again soon enough.